The Dead Sea is one of the strangest places on Earth. Even its name comes from one thing we all fear: death. The water there is 10 times as salty as the ocean, preventing anything from living in it. And it is so salty, you can float. But that's not what we are here to discuss. We are here to discuss the surrounding mystery of the Dead Sea and the treasures found in it that are said to be one of the most valuable finds of the 20th century. The year was 1940. A teenage Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was looking for a lost goat. He had some of his friends assist him in his search. During their search, he stumbled upon a cave that had a small opening. He thought the goat was inside and threw a rock first to get a reaction. If the goat was inside, it would bleat and Muhammad would rescue it. But instead of a bleat, or in a worst-case scenario, silence, he and his friend heard the sound of breaking pottery. So he entered the cave, and that is when he discovered several clay jars containing ancient scrolls. You see, members of the local Bedouin tribes often made extra cash by stealing from archaeological sites and selling them in their local antiquities market, which was what Muhammad did exactly. He and some friends took some of the scrolls to a man named Kondo, an antique trader in Bethlehem, to get an appraisal. Kondo saw and liked what the boys brought, so he sent the Bedouins back to the caves to look for more treasures. They came back with 7 books, which made him very happy. Blind to their real value, the boys sold 4 of the 7 scrolls to Kondo for like $28, and 3 to a second antiquities dealer named Salahi. Kondo then resold the 4 scrolls to Archbishop Samuel, head of the Syrian Orthodox monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem, for a handsome price. Somehow news got around, and Eliezer Lipa Sukenik, a professor at Hebrew University, learned about the scroll's discovery from an Armenian antique trader. He then set out to investigate these findings. He went to meet the Armenian trader at the British-controlled military zone, on the border with Jerusalem, even risking his life for such a meeting, because there were problems between the Arabs and the Jews at that time. Now, Jerusalem, by the summer of 47, was already sharply divided between the Arabs and the Jews. The British, in their effort to please the Arabs and to keep them out of the hands of Russia, had prevented refugees from Europe from landing in Palestinian ports, and this had imposed on the immigrants much hardship and even caused a large number of deaths. To get back at the British, the Jews formed a terrorist group that mostly killed British soldiers, and in retaliation, the British would hang any terrorists caught immediately. The Jews will then retaliate the killings of their people with more killings, using bombs and mines, leaving a hangman's noose at each murder scene. It was basically a perilous time. At the time when the scrolls were offered for sale, the Jewish parts of Jerusalem had been put under martial law. So, if Eliezer was caught, he would have been imprisoned or killed by basically any side. But to him, seeing these scrolls was worth the risk, and he successfully met the buyer. During this secret meeting, the buyer showed the professor a piece of leather to look at. Eliezer could read the old writing as he looked through the wire and trembled with happiness. He was eager to learn more, so he went to Bethlehem with the buyer to see Salahi, who had 3 scrolls with him. When he opened the scrolls, he was amazed to see Hebrew manuscripts that were 1,000 years older than any known Bible text. By 1947, word of the scrolls began to spread among scholars, that some ancient writings were found. These scrolls can prove that God exists, that the Bible is true, or in a worst-case scenario, that Christianity was a sham all along. These ancient scrolls became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, mostly because it was found in that area. The Dead Sea Scrolls are basically manuscripts about past events that go back as far as the 3rd century BCE all the way to the 2nd century CE, which is why the Dead Scrolls are very important. If we were to even look at the Dead Sea Scrolls from a scientific and logical level, devoid of religion, it's still an amazing find, because we get to see and understand what it was like in the past, providing an almost complete picture of ancient civilizations all over the world, not just in Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, and some pieces are still being found, the latest being in 2021. These scrolls were found in 11 caves along the coast, 13 miles east of Jerusalem, and close to the site of Qumran. And there are thousands of caves like these all along the coast, where many more historical manuscripts and artifacts were found. When archaeologists first heard that the Dead Sea Scrolls had been found, they went to the caves and, with the help of shepherds, found tens of thousands of scroll pieces, which together make up between 800 and 900 manuscripts. Over the course of more than 10 years, between 825 and 900 scrolls have been found. Some are full texts, while others are just pieces of paper. As recent as March 2021, Israeli researchers found dozens of pieces of writing from the books of Zechariah and Nahum that were written in Greek. It is thought that these artifacts were hidden in a cave between 132 and 136 CE during the Bar Kokhba revolt. Other discoveries included the remains of a child wrapped in cloth, dated to around 6,000 years ago, and a cache of coins from the days of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Israeli government still found more scrolls in 2021 in the Cave of Horror, a different cave that is near the Dead Sea. The caves around the Dead Sea just keep on giving. In 1953, the Jordanians brought together a group of young scholars from around the world in Jerusalem to sort through all the scrolls. The 7-person team was mostly made up of Catholic priests, with no Jews on it, which in itself was a controversy, and I'm going to talk about it later in the video. This one innocent act or omission almost destroyed Christianity and the Catholic faith. That being said, the 7-person team really did wonders with the task. By 1960, this group of scholars had not only figured out what the pieces of the 800 documents were and how to best arrange them, but they had also deciphered and typed them up so that they could be read. Even now, new pieces are being added to puzzles that have already been identified by them. Anyone who knew Hebrew, or in one case, Aramaic, could read most of the tablets that were still whole. On the other hand, the broken pieces of the scrolls made things more difficult. These scrolls were mostly Hebrew, but about 25% were in Aramaic. What made these types of scrolls hard to read or decipher was that, on average, about 90% of each of these documents was missing, and there weren't many clear places where the pieces fit together. The letters were often fuzzy and unclear. It was just a train wreck. It was like solving a jigsaw puzzle without the pieces. It was hard to keep track of all these different texts or pieces, like psalms that no one had heard before, Bible commentaries, calendar texts, purity rules, rabbinic-style additions to biblical stories, and so on. How do you understand? And if you did manage to understand it, do you understand the context it was said? Was the writer using a metaphor, or was he describing events as it is? Was it sarcasm, or was it real? But luckily by 1960, it was pretty clear what was in the collection. There were more than 200 books of the Hebrew Bible found in the Dead Sea. These ranged in size, like from a small piece to a whole book of the prophet Isaiah. Based on the content of these scrolls, the scrolls were divided into 2 classes, which are biblical and non-biblical texts. Biblical texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments of prophecies by Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel, along with important statements like the last words of Judah, Joseph, Levi, Naphtali, and Amram, which you can find most of them in the Bible. The only book not included in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the Book of Esther. Experts think that the Book of Esther may have been lost or not written because she was married to a Persian king while being Jewish, which might have been looked down upon by the people, or could even be because the book talks about the Purim holiday, which wasn't on the Qumran timeline. Despite the omission of Esther, some of the text included in these scrolls was written about 1,000 years before the Old Testament, making it the oldest group of texts related to the Old Testament, even before the famous Masoretic texts. You see, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest Hebrew language manuscripts of the Bible were the Masoretic texts, dating as far back as the 9th century, such as the Aleppo Codex. Now, the title for the oldest text now belongs to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which dates back all the way to the 2nd century BCE. Then we have non-biblical texts, which are usually not in the Bible canon, or could just be regular texts, like the mystical texts, apocalyptic texts, liturgical texts, and so on. There were also manuscripts known as apocrypha that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Apocrypha refers to the specific group of books that Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians believe to be canonical, but which are not part of the Hebrew Bible or the Protestant canon. Look, Apocrypha is a whole other thing on its own. If you want us to cover the differences and the reasons for their differences, you can let us know in the comment section. It was pretty easy to put together the pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls that belong to non-biblical text, because the later copy could be used as a guide. A numbering system was also made so that scholars could keep track of the huge number of manuscripts and fragments. A typical example of such a numbering system is something like this, 4Q491. The Q stands for Qumran, and the 4 before it means that the writing was found in Cave 4. This means that 4Q491 refers to text 491 from Cave 4 at Qumran. Every Dead Sea Scroll has this type of numbering system, though there are some that have a more descriptive name. An example is the scroll called the War Scroll, which talks about a fight between the sons of light and the sons of darkness at the end of the world. A piece of the War Scroll was found in 4Q491, but a longer copy was found in Cave 1. As a result, this complete copy is sometimes known as 1Q War Scroll. So sometimes scholars interchange the number. But when put together, the scrolls do tell us a great deal about the situation of Judaism at the dawn of Christianity. It's time for some history lessons. Alexander the Great conquered Persia and took over Judea in 332 BC, starting the process of colonization known as Hellenization, which would go on to have a huge impact on every part of Jewish society. Greek cities sprung up everywhere. Jerusalem itself became a polis in 175 BC. Greek shrines were built and dedicated to gods who were not Jewish, and soon the Greek language became more spoken in Jewish land, and their native Hebrew language was becoming less spoken. This caused a lot of rifts. There were problems between the Hellenizers, who brought Greek ideas and customs to Judea, and the more traditional Jews, who were against Greek influence. There were also problems between the more advanced cities and the more traditional villages, between wealthy city dwellers and poor farmers, and between the rich and the poor. Many Jews felt that these Greek invasions put their faith and the stability of their world at risk. Not everyone liked this, and this led to the famous Maccabean Revolt, which gave birth to the Hasmonean dynasty of Jewish kings and high priests. Stay with me, I am going somewhere with this. Around the middle of the 2nd century BC, a small group of Jews had had enough of the widespread materialism they saw and the degradation of the priestly class, so they moved to the Judean desert to live alone. They formed a community of their own and documented events, ideas, and Bible scrolls. These were the people believed to have written and kept the Dead Sea Scrolls. From their writing, it was clear that they rejected Jerusalem temple, or at least its priesthood, and did things in their own way, though they were known to be strict. Their leader was called the Teacher of Righteousness. This group was quickly identified as the Essenes, a small Jewish group that was written about in detail by the 1st century Jewish writer Josephus. Josephus Flavius 1st century CE Jewish historian. The Qumran-Essene theory was first put forward by Roland Guérin-Devaux and Joseph Tadeusz Milik, and it became the most popular theory among scholars. Based on the Qumran-Essene idea, the scrolls were likely written by the Essenes living at Khirbet Qumran. This idea is backed up by a number of arguments. For example, the geographical writer Pliny the Elder wrote a book after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. He talks about a community of Essenes who lived in the desert on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, close to the destroyed town of Ein Gedi. But even with these proofs, other ideas, like the Qumran sectarian theory, came up. The biggest difference from the Qumran-Essene theory is that it doesn't directly connect the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Essenes. Most people who support the Qumran sectarian theory think that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a group of Jews who lived in or near Qumran. However, they don't always think that the sectarians are in totality the Essenes. It's like how we are grouped by nationality and then by tribe, or clan or state, depending on your country. So these scholars are saying that while we agree that the writers are Jewish, we don't necessarily agree that they are all from one tribe. This added to the mystery surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls. Who wrote it? Was it the very zealous and strict Essenes, or was it the Sadducees? It's a debate that is still argued even today. In such, why that cave? Were the caves used as some sort of storage unit for the scrolls? Or were the scrolls hidden in a rush from being destroyed by the Roman soldiers during a war? Or was it just kept safe for future generations to use? Lots of questions that added more mystery to the Dead Sea Scrolls and its true intention. While the origin of the Dead Sea Scrolls would cause debate among scholars, it was the last thing to be worried about because a greater threat, rumors, and accusations were taking shape that had the power to destroy the whole of Christendom. Scholars and experts were excited about this finding because they thought the Dead Sea Scrolls would either prove or disprove the reliability of textual transmission from the original texts to the oldest Masoretic texts that were available at the time. And oh my God, if it wasn't accurate, that means half of the Bible, be it Ethiopian, Protestant, Catholic, or even Jewish Bible, would be wrong. I can only imagine what that would do to a lot of people, including me. This would be the biggest "I told you so" of the 20th century. However, after much analysis, the findings showed that transmission and translation over 1,000 years were surprisingly accurate. That means both the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were a century older, tally with the Masoretic text, which tallies with the Bible we use today. This makes it reasonable to think that the current versions of the Old Testament are accurate copies of the originals. Then, another problem arose. Remember the 7-panel team of Catholic priests assigned to look over the scrolls? I mentioned it earlier. Well, that came with its own controversies. Since some of the scholars who were studying them were Catholic, rumors spread that the Vatican was keeping the scrolls secret because they contained dangerous truths that would put the Christian faith at risk. Some rumors were that Jesus was married and had children. This story was one of the ideas that went into Dan Brown's book and movie, The Da Vinci Code. These theories spread worldwide, and unfortunately, it was believed by millions. When the Catholic Church saw the danger of assumption that was ravaging the Christian faith, just because they held on to the scrolls, they gladly made the scrolls public to put a stop to the notions circulating the world at the time. The embargo on the unpublished scrolls was broken, and today all of the scrolls are available to the public. They can be viewed at deadseascrolls.org.il. Link in the description below. Also, as soon as the scrolls were found, people started to wonder what they could tell us about early Christianity. The Qumran sectarians and early Christians had a lot in common. Both groups were interested in prophecy and personal holiness. Their members were celibate, and their leaders were called bishops or overseers. But there were obvious and little differences here and there. Nothing new was learned about early Christianity from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they do teach us a lot about the world that Christianity grew up in. Luckily, on its own, anytime a rumor or accusation suffices, the scrolls tend to shut it up with facts written in either goat or sheepskin, which frankly was really impressive. The Dead Sea Scrolls can't be said to be false. It's real. And despite the small differences here and there with other texts, when it comes to the bigger picture, they still say the same thing, or tell the same story. The only issue the scrolls had during its early days was that of organization. Scholars sometimes put different pieces of the same manuscript together by wrongly believing that they came from the same manuscript. Sometimes the pieces are from the same work, like the book of Leviticus, but they could come from different copies. The literary works in the Dead Sea Scrolls are usually put into groups based on what they are about or what type they belong to, which can be confusing. Then there are scholars who have different views on certain labels and categories, and sometimes categorize these scrolls based on their instinct or assumption, like the War Scroll that talks about the war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. Some scholars think it's not necessarily an apocalyptic war reference, but was more about the Essenes fighting back the Romans and driving them off their land, which in a way makes sense, seeing the occupation of Romans was common. Plus, there was a recorded period of war, which the Jews lost greatly to the Romans. To summarize, there were a lot of human errors, but despite these errors, the authenticity of the Dead Sea Scrolls can't be challenged. I do have one question. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are true and authentic, based on real events, from the days of Moses to even Alexander the Great, does that mean everything in the Bible is true? And if it is, are you on the right side of things? Just something to ponder about.